At my son's divorce trial, his mother-in-law sneered and called me the cleaning lady. My own son, ashamed of my simple clothes, told me to stay quiet. They had no idea the judge about to walk in was my oldest and dearest friend. The look on their faces was priceless. Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this has reached. The air in the courthouse hallway was sterile and cold, smelling faintly of old paper and industrial floor polish. I, Eleanor Vance, felt small at 69 years old, swallowed by the cavernous space with its high ceilings and marble floors that echoed every hesitant step. I clutched the worn strap of my handbag, a simple leather pouch I'd found at a thrift store years ago. It was my armor, just like the sensible, low-heeled shoes on my feet and the simple navy dress I wore. These were clothes for a woman who did not wish to be seen, a woman who had long ago learned the art of blending into the background. But today, blending in was not an option. As I approached courtroom 3B, I saw them. My daughter-in-law, Serafina, and her mother, Beatrice, stood like a pair of sleek, predatory birds outside the double doors. Dressed in sharp, expensive suits of charcoal gray and black, their posture was rigid, their faces masks of aristocratic disdain. The moment their eyes landed on Beati, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop another 10 degrees. A wave of icy hostility washed over me, a familiar feeling I had endured for the better part of a decade. Beatrice leaned toward her daughter, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. "Look what the cat dragged in," she said, her painted lips twisting into a smirk. Serafina let out a short, brittle laugh, a sound like glass shattering. "Mother, please," she replied, not even bothering to lower her own voice. "These legal proceedings are far too complex for someone like her. She'll probably think alimony is a brand of pasta." Their laughter followed, sharp and cruel. They surveyed me from head to toe, their gazes lingering on my practical shoes and my second-hand bag. "She looks like she's here to clean the floors, not sit in the gallery," Beatrice added, with a final dismissive sniff. Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and though I tried to let them bounce off my invisible shield of composure, they found their mark. It was a familiar pain, a slow, methodical erosion of my spirit that they had perfected over years. Their cruelty was systematic, designed to make me feel insignificant, to remind me that I, a woman from a simple, working-class background, had never been good enough for their family, and especially not for my own son. But I was here for him. I was here for Liam. My son, who had been so thoroughly absorbed into their world of wealth and privilege that he had forgotten his own roots. My son, who hadn't returned a single one of my calls in 8 long months. The silence had been a gaping wound in my heart, and seeing him today, even in this dreadful place, was a desperate attempt to stitch it closed, if only for a moment. Just then, Serafina's lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Davies, joined them. He gave me a cursory glance, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if I were a piece of furniture left in the wrong place. "Ah, Mrs. Vance," he said, the title dripping with condescension. "I trust you won't be interfering." It was then that I knew. They had painted me as the villain in this drama, the problematic mother-in-law whose influence had somehow corrupted their perfect marriage. The courtroom doors opened, and they swept past me without another word. A moment later, Liam arrived. My heart gave a painful lurch. He looked exhausted. The skin under his eyes was bruised with fatigue, and his expensive suit seemed to hang off his weary frame. His gaze swept the hallway, and for a fleeting second, it met mine. But he looked away almost instantly, a flicker of shame or irritation crossing his face. He walked over to me, his steps heavy. "Mom," he said, his voice low and tight, "please just sit in the back. Let's keep this civil." The words weren't a plea for peace, they were a clear sign of his embarrassment. He was ashamed of me, of my simple dress and my worn-out shoes. He was ashamed of where he came from. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump forming in my throat. I found a seat on a hard wooden bench at the very back of the courtroom, making myself as small as possible. Beatrice, sitting several rows ahead, turned and whispered something to Serafina about the difference in breeding, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. I lowered my eyes to my lap, my hands trembling slightly as I held on to my old handbag. Let them think what they wanted. Let them see a poor, simple old woman. Let them believe they held all the power. They were about to discover, in the most public way imaginable, how very wrong they were. They had no idea who I truly was. A hush fell over the room as a uniformed bailiff stepped forward. "All rise," his voice boomed, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Albright presiding." As I sat on that hard bench, the cold, impersonal voice of the bailiff seemed to fade away. The present dissolved and my mind drifted back 7 years, to a day that had been filled with such nervous hope. It was the day Liam first brought Serafina to my small apartment. I remember how proud he looked, his arm possessively around her waist, his eyes begging me to love her as much as he did. I had wanted to. Oh, how I had wanted to. I had spent 2 days cleaning, and the aroma of my special pot roast, the one he had always called his favorite, filled every corner of our little home. Serafina was undeniably beautiful, like a porcelain doll, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. Her gaze, cool and appraising, swept over my living room, taking in the worn but comfortable armchair, the hand-knitted afghan draped over the sofa, and the shelves crowded with photos of Liam's childhood. "How charming," she had murmured, the word hanging in the air like a delicate insult. At dinner, she barely touched the food I had so lovingly prepared, pushing the tender pieces of meat around her plate while she spoke of her family's recent trip to the Swiss Alps and a charity gala they were hosting. My son, caught between the two worlds I represented, tried to build a bridge, telling her how I used to read to him every night in that very armchair. Serafina had simply smiled and changed the subject back to the exorbitant cost of maintaining their family's yacht. That dinner was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it then. It marked the start of a gradual, systematic campaign to erase me from my son's life. Liam, bless his heart, had genuinely hoped we would become the best of friends. But Serafina had other plans. Our weekly dinners at my apartment were the first casualty. They were replaced by invitations to exclusive restaurants and country clubs, where the menus were in French and a single appetizer cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I felt perpetually out of place, a simple sparrow in a flock of peacocks. I would sit in silence, my worn handbag in my lap, while they discussed stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. Liam, so desperate to fit into this glittering new world, seemed oblivious to my discomfort. Holidays were next. My cozy Christmases, filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, were replaced by sterile, formal gatherings at Serafina's family estate. I became a ghost at their celebrations, a forgotten relic from Liam's past. I'd wander through vast, cold rooms, observing the hollow rituals of people who had everything and seemed to feel nothing. It was at one of those parties that Beatrice delivered one of her most memorable blows. She found me standing awkwardly near the dining room, and with a saccharine smile, she gestured down a long hallway. "The kitchen is through that door, Eleanor," she had said, her voice loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "If you'd like to help the staff, I'm sure you'd be more comfortable there." The laughter of those around her was quiet but sharp. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning wave of humiliation. I looked for Liam, but he was across the room, laughing at some joke, completely unaware of his mother being treated like the hired help. He never noticed, or perhaps he chose not to. The slights piled up, each one a small stone added to the wall being built between my son and me. At their engagement party, a lavish affair held in a downtown ballroom, Serafina greeted me not as her future mother-in-law, but as a minor acquaintance. "Oh, Mrs. Vance," she'd said, her eyes already scanning the room for more important guests. "You came." The implication was clear. My presence was a surprise and not necessarily a welcome one. But the cruelest cut, the one that sliced the deepest, came from Beatrice later that evening. I was standing near a potted palm, trying to make myself invisible, when I overheard her speaking to another guest. "Liam is such a remarkable young man," she gushed, "completely self-made. He truly started from nothing, you know." Nothing. My years of working 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. The nights I went to bed hungry so he could have a full plate. The life insurance policy I cashed in from his father to pay for his college tuition. All of it, my entire life sacrifice, was erased in that single careless sentence. I was nothing. I was the dirt he had sprung from, something to be brushed off his expensive shoes. And now, sitting in this courtroom, watching them, I knew they still saw me as nothing. The true turning point, the moment the subtle chill became a deep and permanent frost, was at a dinner meant to plan the wedding. For the first time in months, they had invited me to a restaurant, one with velvet ropes and a wine list thicker than a telephone book. A fragile little bud of hope bloomed in my chest. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps now that the wedding was official, I would finally be welcomed into the fold as family. The hope withered and died before the appetizers arrived. When the waiter came to our table, Serafina held up a perfectly manicured hand, stopping me before I could speak. "I've gone ahead and ordered the sea bass for Eleanor," she announced to the table. Then she turned to me, her smile a masterpiece of condescension. "I know how overwhelming these menus can be for people who aren't used to fine dining. This is a very safe choice." I felt my son's eyes on me, pleading for me to just go along with it, to not make a scene. So it smiled and said thank you, feeling like a child who wasn't trusted to order for herself. The main course arrived, and with it, the main event. Beatrice delicately dabbed her lips with a linen napkin before leaning forward. "Eleanor," she began, her tone suggesting we were discussing something as trivial as the weather. "We were thinking about family contributions for the wedding. We feel a token of $15,000 from your side would be appropriate." $15,000. It might as well have been $1 million. It was more than my entire life savings, the small emergency fund I had painstakingly built over decades. My voice was quiet when I responded, the truth catching in my throat. "Beatrice, that's a very generous thought. I'll have to look at my finances and see what's possible." The atmosphere at the table didn't just cool, it froze solid. Serafina's polite smile vanished. Beatrice's expression hardened. I had failed their test. I had proven once and for all that I could not keep up, that I did not belong. After that night, the silence I had been dreading finally fell. The weekly check-in calls from Liam stopped completely. When I tried to phone him, it was always Serafina who answered, her voice syrupy sweet with false concern. "Oh, Eleanor, he's just swamped with the wedding plans right now," she would say. Or, "He's under so much stress at work, I'm trying to shield him from any extra pressures." I was the extra pressure. I was the problem to be managed. At the wedding itself, I was a ghost. They seated me at a table in the back corner with a collection of Serafina's twice-removed cousins who I had never met. I watched my son get married from the social equivalent of Siberia. During the photographs, the polite but firm photographer, clearly acting on instructions, created a circle of family around the happy couple. As I stepped forward to join them, he put a hand up. "Ma'am, if you could just step out of the frame for a moment. We're just doing the immediate family now." The words echoed in the sudden quiet. I was not immediate family. I was an accessory, an optional extra. Out of hundreds of photos taken that day, only one included me, a strained, awkward shot of Liam and me standing side by side, a foot of empty space between us, a chasm that felt 100 miles wide. The final fatal blow came as they were leaving the reception, showered in rice and fake smiles. On their way to a honeymoon in Bora Bora, I managed to catch Liam's arm for just a second. "I love you," I whispered, my heart aching. He didn't meet my eyes. He gently removed my hand from his sleeve. "Mom," he said, his voice flat and detached. "I think it's better if we keep some distance for a while, for Serafina's sake. She feels watched. We'll talk later." Later, that one word hung in the air, a promise as empty as my arms. Later never came. The distance wasn't for a while, it was forever. I learned of the birth of my first grandchild from a gossiping neighbor who had seen the announcement on social media. My second I found out about from a Christmas card sent by a mutual acquaintance. That was the life they had built for my son, a life in which his own mother was a stranger. The scraping of chairs and the collective rustle of clothing brought me back to the present. The judge, a man with a kind face and a halo of white hair, settled into his high-backed chair behind the bench. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and picked up a file. "We are here today," he began, his voice calm and authoritative, "to hear the case of Vance versus Vance regarding the dissolution of marriage." He began to read the formal language of the court, his gaze sweeping over the room from the plaintiff's table to the defendant's, a routine practice gesture. Then his eyes continued their journey, scanning the public gallery. And then they stopped. They landed on me, sitting in the back row, a small, quiet woman in a simple navy dress. The change in his demeanor was instantaneous and absolute. His professional mask didn't just crack, it shattered. His eyes widened, the file in his hand forgotten. His mouth parted slightly, and the hand that had been resting on the gavel froze midair. The courtroom, which had been filled with the low hum of anticipation, fell into a sudden, deafening silence. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. The judge leaned forward, squinting as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer that of a judge addressing his court. It was the voice of a man in utter shock, filled with a disbelief so profound it bordered on reverence. "Chief Justice Eleanor Vance," he said, the words echoing in the stunned quiet. "What on earth are you doing here?" Every single head in the courtroom swiveled in my direction. It was like a wave cresting and breaking, 100 pairs of eyes washing over me. Mr. Davies, Serafina's slick lawyer, blinked rapidly, his composure gone. Beatrice's face was a comical progression of emotions, from confusion to disbelief and then, finally, to a dawning, horrified understanding. Serafina's perfectly painted mouth fell open, her mask of aristocratic superiority dissolving into raw, slack-jawed shock. But it was Liam's face that I will never forget. He turned slowly in his chair, his expression one of utter bewilderment. He stared at me, at the mother he had been so ashamed of just moments before, as if he were seeing a complete stranger. The cleaning lady, the simple woman who wasn't smart enough for complex legal proceedings, the embarrassing parent to be hidden away. In his eyes, I saw it all, the confusion, the shock, and then a slow, terrible wave of shame that washed over his features, turning his face a pale, sickly color. It was the look of a man realizing he didn't know the first thing about the woman who had given him life. With a composure I did not feel, I slowly rose to my feet. The worn strap of my thrift store handbag felt steady in my hand. I met the judge's astonished gaze. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and even, carrying easily through the silent room. "I'm here as Liam's mother. This is a family matter." Judge Albright, still reeling, shook his head as if to clear it. He looked from me to a pale and trembling Serafina. He seemed to grasp the entire situation in a single intuitive flash. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice now laced with an edge of steel, "for your information, the woman you and your mother have been whispering about in the hallway is not some simpleton off the street." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Chief Justice Eleanor Vance served on the state Supreme Court for 22 years. For her retirement, she was one of the most brilliant legal minds this state has ever seen. She wrote the majority opinion on the Harrison case, for God's sake. She is, without question, one of the most respected jurists in this state's history." The color drained completely from Serafina's face. She looked as if she had been physically struck. The entire carefully constructed narrative of my inferiority, the foundation upon which they had built years of cruelty and exclusion, had just been demolished in a single devastating blow. The cleaning lady was a chief justice. The woman, too simple for fine dining, had a legal mind that men like Judge Albright revered. The judge then turned his piercing gaze on my son. "Mr. Vance," he asked, his tone deceptively soft, "were you aware of your mother's professional history?" Liam could only stammer, his eyes darting between me and the judge, trapped in a spotlight of his own ignorance. Well, we don't really discuss." His voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence a confession in itself. He didn't know. He had never thought to ask. The shock in that courtroom was just the beginning. If you want to see how this story truly unravels, make sure you're following along, and let me know in the comments what you think their reaction will be when they find out the whole truth. Now let me tell you what they really didn't know. As Judge Albright declared a recess for lunch, the buzzing in the courtroom was a physical force. But for me, the noise faded into a distant hum. My mind was not in that room, but 23 years in the past, in a stuffy office late at night, staring down a man who believed he was above the law. His name was Alistair Sterling, Beatrice's father, Serafina's grandfather. He was a titan of industry, a man whose picture was frequently in the financial papers, lauded for his cutthroat business acumen. In reality, he was a predator, running a massive fraud scheme that had ruined hundreds of small investors, hardworking people who had lost their life savings. I was the prosecutor assigned to the case, a young, determined lawyer who still believed unequivocally in justice. Alistair Sterling, much like his daughter and granddaughter would years later, took one look at my simple suits and my non-designer handbag and wrote me off. He assumed I could be bought. He tried to bribe me, sending emissaries with envelopes of cash. He tried to intimidate me with veiled threats about my career and my safety. I remember him sitting across from me in that office, a smug smile on his face. "A woman from your background, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice a low purr of condescension. "A little money could go a long way. Think of the life you could give that little boy of yours." He was talking about Liam. He had miscalculated. He didn't understand that my background, the one he so disdained, was the very source of my strength. I had seen what financial ruin did to good families. I knew the desperation of making every penny count. What he saw as weakness was my unwavering moral compass. I refused his bribes, but I did more than that. I documented every single attempt. I recorded every threatening phone call. I built a second case against him, one of obstruction and intimidation, on top of the mountain of evidence for his financial crimes. When the verdict came in and he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, the look of utter disbelief on his face was something I never forgot. He couldn't comprehend being brought down by a woman he considered his inferior. The Sterling family never forgave me. For years, they waged a quiet war, using their money and influence to try and undermine my career, spreading rumors and filing frivolous complaints. But I persevered, and as I rose through the ranks, their efforts became futile. Eventually, I thought they had given up. Now, standing in this courtroom, the horrific, cruel irony of it all settled upon me like a shroud. This wasn't a coincidence. Serafina hadn't just met and fallen in love with my son. She had targeted him, marrying my son, pulling him into their world, and then systematically cutting him off from me. It was the ultimate revenge. A revenge not with a bang, but with a slow, torturous silence. They sought to destroy the one thing I valued more than my career, my relationship with my child. And for a time, they had succeeded. The lunch recess was a circus. As soon as we were out in the main hall, cell phones came out. I could hear whispers of my name echoing off the marble. "Chief Justice Vance here in family court." The news spread through the city's legal community like wildfire. Reporters began to show up. From the window, I watched Serafina, Beatrice, and a very pale Mr. Davies huddled by their black Mercedes, their conversation frantic and panicked. Beatrice gesticulated wildly, her usual composure gone. Serafina stared at her phone, her face ashen. They were trapped, their carefully constructed world imploding around them. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that things were about to get much, much worse for them. Their legal troubles were just beginning. When the bailiff called us back for the afternoon session, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. The air was thick with a palpable tension. The gallery was fuller now, with lawyers and clerks who had come on their lunch breaks to witness the spectacle. Mr. Davies, who had been so slick and confident that morning, looked as though he hadn't eaten in a week. He fumbled with his papers, his hands trembling slightly. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He wouldn't even look toward the bench. He knew, as did I, that the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This was no longer a simple divorce case. It was a reckoning. When the proceedings resumed, Mr. Davies stood, but he was a changed man. The arrogance had been replaced by a cautious, almost fearful deference. His opening statement, which I'm certain was originally drafted to paint me as a meddling, vindictive monster, was now a masterclass in verbal gymnastics. He spoke of irreconcilable differences and divergent life paths, carefully tiptoeing around any mention of family conflict. He had seen the cliff edge and was desperately trying to pull his client back. But Serafina, blinded by years of unchecked privilege and a lifetime of getting her own way, refused to be pulled. She saw her carefully planned victory slipping away, and in a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris, she decided to double down. She interrupted her own lawyer, a gasp of manufactured pain escaping her lips. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Mr. Davies is being too kind. The truth is, Liam's mother never accepted me. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. She looked directly at me, her eyes glassy with false tears. From the very beginning, she saw me as a threat. She was jealous of my relationship with her son. She constantly tried to turn him against me, to poison our marriage with her bitterness. The lie was so breathtaking in its audacity, so completely inverted from the reality I had lived, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. The years of quiet dignity, of swallowing insults and enduring slights, all of it threatened to crumble. A hot, white anger, an emotion I had not allowed myself to feel for a very long time, surged through me. My composure, the shield I had held for so long, finally cracked. I had come here today to support my son, to simply be a presence in the back of the room, but Serafina had just made it about me, and that was a mistake. In that instant, I made a decision. I would no longer be the silent, invisible woman in the back row. I rose from my seat, my sensible shoes making a soft, determined sound on the polished floor. I walked down the central aisle, not as a grieving mother, but as the jurist I had been for over 2 decades. Every eye was on me. I saw the panic flare in Mr. Davies' face. I saw the flash of triumphant malice in Serafina's. I stopped before the bar, the wooden railing that separates the observers from the participants, and I looked directly at the bench. My voice when I spoke was not the quiet, hesitant one they had heard before. It was the voice of command, the voice that had silenced courtrooms for years. "Your Honor," I said, my tone resonating with judicial authority, "I request permission to address the court." A gasp went through the room. This was a wild breach of protocol. Mr. Davies shot to his feet. "Objection! This is highly irregular." Judge Albright held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at me, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even anticipation in his eyes. He knew me. He knew I would not make such a request lightly. "Given the unique circumstances that have come to light," he said, his gaze sweeping over Serafina's smug face, "and the direct accusations made against a member of the gallery, I'm going to overrule the irregularity." "Permission granted, Justice Vance." I stepped forward, my hands resting lightly on the lectern. I didn't need notes. I had lived this testimony. Calmly, methodically, I began to speak. I dismantled Serafina's claims, not with emotion, but with facts. I detailed the first dinner, the move to exclusive clubs, the holidays where I was treated like a servant. I described the wedding photographer asking me to step out of the frame for immediate family. I recounted the last words my son had spoken to me at his wedding reception. I laid out 7 years of systematic exclusion and quiet humiliation, piece by painful piece. And then, when I had their complete, rapt attention, I delivered the final, devastating blow. "But you see, Your Honor," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. "The animosity from Ms. Sterling and her family did not begin 7 years ago when she met my son. Our connection goes back much further than this marriage." I turned my gaze to Beatrice, whose face had gone a chalky white. "It goes back 23 years to a criminal trial. The case of the state versus Alastair Sterling." The name dropped into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. Alastair Sterling, Serafina's grandfather, who I prosecuted and convicted for a fraud scheme that destroyed hundreds of lives. A man who tried to bribe and intimidate me to drop the case. A man who couldn't believe a woman from my background would refuse his money. The courtroom erupted. The whispers turned into a roar of shock and comprehension as every piece of the puzzle slammed into place. And through the chaos, my eyes found my son. Liam was staring at me, his face a mask of dawning horror. For the first time, he wasn't seeing the simple mother or the celebrated judge. He was seeing the whole picture, and the terrible, calculated cruelty of the family he had chosen over his own was finally, brutally clear. Judge Albright, his face a grim mask, called for a 1-hour recess to allow the chaos to settle. The moment he left the bench, the courtroom became a hive of frantic activity, but I saw none of it. I only saw Liam, making his way toward me through the crowd like a man wading through deep water. His face was shattered. The fatigue he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by a raw, profound anguish. He stopped in front of me, his eyes searching mine, desperate for a denial that I could not give him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, Is it true? Everything you said about Serafina's grandfather? I looked at my son, my heart aching with a mixture of love and a deep, abiding sadness for all the years we had lost. Yes, Liam, I said quietly. It's all true. I knew who she was the day you brought her home. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his own ignorance finally crashing down on him. I'm so sorry, he choked out, tears welling in his eyes. I didn't know. I had no idea. I reached out and gently touched his arm, my touch firm but not unkind. I know you didn't, sweetheart, I told him, the words tasting like bitter medicine. You had no idea because you never bothered to ask. The truth of it hung between us, a stark and painful indictment of the man he had allowed himself to become. Before he could respond, a flustered Mr. Davies appeared at my elbow. Justice Vance, he said, his voice low and urgent. May I have a private word? I nodded, and we moved to a quiet alcove near the windows, leaving Liam to grapple with his newfound reality. Mr. Davies wrung his hands, his professional poise completely gone. Please, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Show some mercy. There are children involved. Think of your grandchildren. He was playing the only card he had left, the one he thought could appeal to the grandmother, not the judge. But he was mistaken about the woman he was dealing with. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression unyielding. I'm not upset, Mr. Davies, I said, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. I'm calculating. From my worn thrift store handbag, I produced a thick manila folder and placed it on the marble window ledge between us. You seem to be under the impression that this is merely a matter of family history and personal slights. It is not. I tapped the folder. This contains forensic accounting reports, bank statements, and sworn affidavits. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that your client has been systematically embezzling funds from my son's company for the last 3 years. Mr. Davies' face went white. That's a very serious accusation, he stammered. It is, I agreed, and I have the evidence to back it up. The total comes to approximately $430,000. His jaw went slack with horror, but I wasn't finished. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a small, discreet digital voice recorder. And then there's the matter of motive. I pressed play. The sound was crystal clear. It was a recording I had made 2 years ago, when a private investigator I'd hired had placed a listening device in my son's home office. Serafina's voice, dripping with venom, filled the quiet alcove. Of course, this is about making that witch pay for what she did to grandfather's legacy. Honestly, Liam is so pathetic. He's so desperate for my approval, he'll do anything I ask. He signs whatever I put in front of him without even reading it. Then Beatrice's voice, cool and conspiratorial. Just be patient, darling. We'll bleed him dry, and by the time he figures it out, we'll have everything, and that old hag of his will have nothing. I stopped the recording. Mr. Davies looked like he was going to be physically ill. That, I said calmly, is admissible in both civil and criminal court. I closed the manila folder and pushed it toward him. So here are my terms. Your client will walk away from this marriage with her personal belongings and nothing more. She will agree to Liam having primary physical and legal custody of the children. She will sign a legally binding agreement to repay every single penny she stole. And she will sign a full written confession to embezzlement and fraud to be held in trust by my attorney. If she violates any part of the custody or repayment agreement, that confession goes directly to the district attorney. I glanced at the clock on the wall. You have until court reconvenes to get her signature. This offer expires in 45 minutes. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom for the final time, the atmosphere was no longer tense with anticipation. It was funereal. The buzzing excitement had been replaced by a somber, heavy silence. I noted with a detached sense of satisfaction that Beatrice's chair was empty. She had fled, unwilling to witness the public dismantling of her family's pride and the complete and utter humiliation of her daughter. She had been the architect of this revenge, but like all cowards, she could not bear to watch the final collapse of the structure she had so carefully designed. Mr. Davies, looking 10 years older than he had that morning, rose slowly. Your Honor, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. My client would like to make a statement. Serafina stood, her legs visibly shaking beneath her expensive suit. The paper in her hands trembled. The mask of the victim, the porcelain doll fragility, was gone. All that remained was a woman stripped bare of her arrogance, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed and empty. She began to read from the prepared statement, her voice flat and robotic at first, the words of a hostage reading a captor's demands. She formally retracted all her earlier claims against me. She admitted in stark, unadorned language that she had systematically manipulated her husband and intentionally excluded me from their family life. Her voice, which had been so steady, finally broke as she reached the heart of her confession. "I did these things," she read, a genuine sob catching in her throat, "not because of any fault in Eleanor Vance, but because of a long-standing family grudge that had absolutely nothing to do with Liam or our marriage. I used my husband as a weapon in a war he knew nothing about." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, steeling herself for what came next. "Furthermore," she continued, the words coming out in a pained rush, "I wish to confess that over the past 3 years, I have systematically and intentionally embezzled funds from my husband's business accounts. The total amount is approximately $430,000. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. It was one thing to hear me make the accusation. It was another entirely to hear the confession from her own lips. I glanced at Liam. His face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated betrayal. The color had drained from his skin, leaving him ghostly white. He stared at the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, as if she were a monster he was seeing for the first time. He finally understood that the woman he had defended and chosen, over and over again, had never loved him at all. He had been a tool, a means to an end. Serafina let the paper fall from her hand. For the first time, she looked directly at me, her eyes pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice now just a broken whisper. "But for what it's worth, I'm sorry." Judge Albright leaned forward, his expression stern. "Miss Sterling, are you making this statement of your own free will, fully aware of the potential criminal consequences of admitting to a felony in open court?" Serafina nodded, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, a mere formality based on her own admissions. The divorce was granted. Liam would retain full ownership of his business and all its assets. Their marital home was to be sold, with the proceeds going directly to Liam to begin repaying the stolen funds. And most importantly, Liam was granted sole physical and legal custody of their 2 children. Serafina was granted supervised visitation, contingent upon her continued cooperation and repayment of the debt. It was a complete and total victory. The courtroom slowly emptied, the spectators and lawyers filing out, their hushed conversations echoing in the large room. Soon it was just Liam and me, standing in the aisle where hours before he had told me to keep quiet. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a universe of pain, regret, and confusion. "Mom," he said, his voice raw, "why? Why didn't you tell me any of this sooner? About her grandfather? About the money?" I met his gaze, my own heart heavy with the weight of his question. I put my hand on his cheek, the first time I had touched him in years. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Liam," I said softly, the truth both a comfort and a condemnation. "You were so in love, so caught up in their world. If I had told you, you would have seen it as jealousy, as me trying to sabotage your happiness. You had to see it for yourself. You had to hear it from her. It was the only way." He stared at me, the full weight of his choices crashing down on him in the echoing silence of the empty courtroom. My words hung in the air, a simple explanation for a complex and painful silence that had stretched on for years. I knew I had to say more. He needed to understand the true cost of his blindness, not for my sake, but for his. "It was never about the money or their fancy houses, Liam," I continued, my voice soft but unsparing. "It was about you. It was about losing my son, piece by piece. I lost 7 years of birthdays and holidays. I lost the chance to know my own grandchildren. But the worst part, the part that kept me awake at night, was that I lost 7 years wondering what I had done wrong as a mother to make you so ashamed of me." That was what finally broke him. A raw, ragged sob tore from his chest, and he buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. The perfect suit, the expensive watch, the entire facade of the man he had tried to be. It all fell away, leaving only my little boy, lost and hurting. I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him cry, a cleansing storm that was years overdue. When his sobs subsided, he looked up, his face streaked with tears and shame. "How can we ever fix this?" he whispered. I gave him a small, sad smile. "We don't fix it," I said gently. "We start over, slowly, carefully, with honesty this time. That's the only way." 3 months later, my small apartment, once so quiet and lonely, was filled with the sounds of life. The clatter of toys on the hardwood floor, the high-pitched squeal of my granddaughter Chloe, the deeper laughter of my grandson Leo, and the smell, the rich, savory aroma of pot roast, the meal that had once been rejected, now filled the air with the scent of home. Liam sat at my small kitchen table, helping 7-year-old Leo with a drawing, a look of quiet contentment on his face I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. He visited every week now, bringing the children, reintroducing me to their lives and them to mine. Our relationship was a fragile, budding thing, but it was real. We were rebuilding, one memory, one shared meal, one honest conversation at a time. I had learned through Liam's lawyer what had happened to the others. Serafina, facing irrefutable evidence, had pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement. Given her full confession and cooperation, she received 5 years of probation in a strict, court-ordered restitution plan. She would be paying for her crimes, both literally and figuratively, for a very long time. Beatrice, upon hearing the full scope of the public humiliation and the criminal charges against her daughter, had suffered a massive stroke. She was now living in a private care facility, unable to speak, the architect of so much pain, trapped in a prison of her own making. There was a time I might have felt a grim satisfaction at this news, but now, standing here, watching my son smile at his daughter, I felt nothing but a distant pity. My victory was not in their downfall. It was here, in the warmth of my kitchen. It was in the feel of Chloe's small hand in mine. "Dinner's ready," I announced, bringing the heavy platter to the table. As we all sat down, the simple scene felt more profound than any courtroom verdict. This was what they had tried to steal from me. This quiet, ordinary, beautiful moment. As I served him a plate, Liam reached out and placed his hand over mine, stopping me. He looked at me, his eyes clear and sincere. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up, for bringing our family back together." I squeezed his hand, my heart full to bursting. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, smiling through the sudden blur of tears in my eyes. We were never apart. We were just waiting for the right moment to find each other again. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. True justice wasn't the cold satisfaction of revenge. It wasn't about winning or making someone pay. It was about restoration. It was about getting back what had been stolen, not through anger, but through patience, truth, and an unwavering belief in the bonds that truly matter. The long, silent game was finally over, and love, in its own quiet, steady way, had won.